in the rich farmlands of Northern California, where acres of orchards stretch endlessly beneath a golden sun, laborers toil silently to bring fruit to America's tables. But in the 1950s and 60s, these fields were more than a symbol of abundance. They were a refuge for thousands of migrant workers who crossed the border in search of work, anonymity, and a new beginning. Among them was Juan Corona, a man who would carve his name into American criminal history, not as a hero of labor, but as one of its darkest betrayers. Juan Corona was born on February 7, 1934, in Autlán, Jalisco, Mexico. He was the product of poverty in a large family, raised during a time when many Mexicans dreamed of a better life north of the border. Like many young men of his era, Juan grew up quickly. By 1950, as a teenager, he had migrated to California to work in the booming agricultural industry. There, he found both opportunity and isolation. Corona wasn't just a field hand, he was ambitious. Over time he rose through the ranks, from a seasonal picker to a labor contractor. This position gave him status and authority. He was the man who hired and placed migrant workers onto farms across Sutter County. His ability to speak both Spanish and English made him valuable to growers and workers alike. He knew the fields intimately, and he knew the men who worked them, but as Juan built a respectable exterior, his internal world began to crack. What most people didn't know, what many couldn't even imagine, was that Juan Corona carried within him a long history of mental instability. In 1956, while still a young man, Juan suffered a violent mental breakdown, paranoid and delusional. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and committed to DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California. Records show that he experienced hallucinations, intense mood swings, and irrational fear of being persecuted by unknown enemies. He was treated with electroshock therapy and prescribed psychiatric medication. However, after a short stay, he was released deemed stable and fit to return to society. His mental illness was largely forgotten by those around him, buried beneath layers of hard work and a growing family. He married and had children. He purchased a modest home. On the surface, Juan Corona was the embodiment of the American dream. But below that facade, his mind continued to deteriorate. Friends and family noticed that Juan was often withdrawn, moody, and increasingly paranoid. He became obsessed with order and control. He distrusted strangers and became easily agitated, particularly when dealing with the laborers he was meant to help. Some said he would mutter to himself. Others claimed he was convinced people were out to steal from him or sabotage his work. Despite these warning signs, Juan continued to be trusted as a labor contractor, gatekeeper between the workers and the fields. Corona's job gave him access to the most vulnerable individuals in California's agricultural community. Migrant workers, most undocumented, transient, or simply impoverished, relied on people like him for survival. They lived in shanty camps, motels, or makeshift shelters near the farms. Their names were rarely recorded, their families far away, and their fates almost never questioned. These were men who could vanish without anyone noticing, and that's exactly what started happening. Beginning in 1970, whispers circulated among farm owners. Some workers simply stopped showing up. Juan would explain it away. They left, he'd say, too lazy to work. Moved on to Oregon, or back to Mexico. In most cases, the explanation sufficed. There were always more workers to replace the missing ones. No one kept track, and no one asked questions. Juan's power over this world grew even stronger. No one knew he was using that power for something unimaginably sinister. What caused Juan Corona to turn from an unstable man into a cold-blooded killer remains uncertain. Some psychologists believe it was the result of untreated schizophrenia, mixed with years of internalized rage and isolation. Others argue that Juan grew to despise the very people he once was, transient, poor, and disposable. There's also the possibility that he viewed his victims as threats or projections of his paranoia, lashing out to eliminate imaginary enemies. Whatever the root cause, by the time the killing began, Juan had constructed a life where he could commit atrocities in plain sight. His status gave him trust, his job gave him access, and his quiet demeanor made him invisible to suspicion. He used his knowledge of the orchards to choose remote burial sites. He timed his attacks during the late hours, when the fields were deserted. The workers, already invisible to society, became the perfect prey. Juan Corona was not the kind of killer the public expected. He was not a loner living on the fringes, nor a drifter passing through towns. He was a man deeply embedded in his community, respected by some, feared by others, and completely unsuspected until it was far too late. By the time law enforcement began to realize what was happening, more than 24 men had already vanished. But their stories were not entirely lost. The orchards they worked would soon yield more than peaches. They would uncover secrets soaked in blood and buried beneath the very soil Juan Corona once walked. In the spring of 1971, a quiet dread began to settle over Yuba City, California. To the casual observer, it was business as usual, rows of fruit trees basking under the sun, workers hunched over crops, tractors humming in the distance. But to those who paid close attention, something was wrong. Men were disappearing, and not just any men. These were the invisible cogs of the agricultural machine, migrant laborers, disposable, voiceless, and alone. It began with subtle absences. A man who worked a few days on a peach farm suddenly vanished. A worker who had checked into a local flophouse never returned for his things. In the transitory world of migrant labor, these weren't rare occurrences. People came and went without much notice. They moved with the harvest, chasing seasonal work. So when someone disappeared, few bothered to look. Fewer still reported it. But as the weeks passed, patterns emerged. Ranchers noticed that some workers left behind wages money owed to them for hard days in the sun. Others had belongings still packed in bunkhouses. Even more alarming, some of these men were last seen after being hired by the same labor contractor, Juan Corona. Juan had a reputation for hiring strong, capable men and placing them on farms where they'd work long hours for little pay. Many of these workers were undocumented, isolated from family, and distrustful of law enforcement. Corona was seen as their lifeline to employment, housing, and meals. But now, that lifeline was beginning to look more like a noose. One by one, names began to disappear from the informal rosters Juan kept. When asked, he always had a plausible answer. He moved on. He didn't want to work. He went back home. And in an industry that thrived on impermanence, those answers were accepted. There were no social security numbers, no emergency contacts. The missing were essentially ghosts. It wasn't until early May of 1971 that the darkness beneath Yuba City's fertile lands was unearthed literally. On May 19th, a local rancher named Goro Kagihiro made a chilling discovery. While checking irrigation lines near one of his orchards, he noticed a patch of soil that looked recently disturbed. Curious, he began to dig. A few inches down, the metallic smell of blood rose with the dirt. What he found would ignite one of the most horrific murder investigations in California history. A mutilated male corpse, partially decomposed, with deep wounds to the head and neck. Authorities were called immediately. The body, buried in a shallow grave beneath a peach tree, had clearly been hacked apart with a sharp blade. The murder was gruesome overkill in every sense of the word. Police quickly cordoned off the area and began a deeper excavation. Within hours, they found another body, then another. By the end of the first day, 4 graves had been unearthed. Word spread quickly. Ranchers began to check their own lands. Within days, more bodies were discovered, each one buried in a similar manner, shallow, hidden among the trees, and bearing signs of brutal machete attacks. Some victims had their skulls cleaved open. Others had deep slashes across their faces and torsos. The injuries were not just fatal, they were personal, frenzied, and hateful. The panic in Yuba City was palpable. Reporters descended on the quiet town, labeling it the site of a serial killer's dumping ground. Families of farm workers began to fear the worst, but many had no way to confirm the fate of their loved ones. Some victims were never formally reported missing. Others were never identified at all. In total, 25 bodies would eventually be pulled from the orchards, making it one of the deadliest serial murder cases in American history at that time. Each victim was male, between the ages of 40 and 60, and of transient or migrant status. Most had been stabbed or bludgeoned before being hacked with what investigators would later confirm was a machete or similar long blade. None of the bodies showed signs of robbery or sexual assault. The killer had buried them in lines, with little attempt to conceal the graves beyond a loose patch of dirt and leaves. Detectives began connecting the dots. All the ranches where bodies were found had a common link. Juan Corona had placed workers on each one. As police dug deeper into the timeline of the murders and who had access to the victims, suspicion rapidly narrowed. When multiple receipts, grocery slips, and work logs bearing Corona's name were found at burial sites, a disturbing portrait began to take shape. Police launched a full surveillance operation on Juan Corona. His movements were tracked, his home staked out. On May 26th, less than a week after the first body was found, detectives arrived at his modest house near the Feather River with a search warrant. What they would find inside would seal his fate and confirm the community's worst fears. But even before the evidence, before the trial, before the mugshot that would come to define him, Juan Corona had already succeeded in creating something horrific, a killing field in the orchards of California. He turned the land that fed a nation into a mass graveyard, and he chose his victims carefully, men whose lives were worth little in the eyes of society, but whose deaths would ultimately shake it to its core. The orchards, once symbols of growth and life, had become the final resting place for the forgotten. The fruit still ripened, the sun still rose, but underneath that soil, a silent horror had festered, and no one had noticed until it was far too late. The discovery of dozens of mutilated bodies buried across Northern California orchards had already shaken Yuba City to its core, but law enforcement knew their work was just beginning. Identifying the victims, determining a pattern, and most importantly finding the person responsible would be a Herculean task. There were no witnesses, no security footage, and the victims had no fixed addresses. But killers always leave a trace, and in this case, the soil would give up more than just the bodies, it would give up the truth, as more graves were uncovered across several farms in Sutter County. Forensic teams began methodically cataloging the crime scenes. Each body was in a similar state: male, middle-aged, transient, and brutally murdered. Many had multiple deep wounds, some consistent with a machete, others with blunt force trauma. The injuries showed a disturbing level of rage. These weren't clean executions, they were vicious, prolonged attacks. But the killer had made mistakes. In one of the graves, buried alongside the victim's remains, detectives discovered two torn receipts. The first was for a meat purchase at a local market dated April 27, 1971. The second was a receipt for gasoline. Both bore the name Juan V. Corona. Investigators immediately recognized the name. Juan Corona was a known labor contractor, someone who placed migrant workers on local farms. But more importantly, several of the victims had last been seen in his presence, or had been hired by him days before disappearing. The receipts were a breakthrough, but the investigation was far from over. With this lead, authorities obtained a search warrant for Corona's home, a small but tidy house near the Feather River. On May 26, 1971, a team of detectives arrived at the residence. They were about to uncover the darkest pieces of the puzzle pieces that would solidify Juan Corona's name in the annals of American true crime. Inside Corona's home, officers found what they later described as a killer's toolkit. There was a blood-stained machete tucked behind a utility shelf, its blade long and rusted, as if hastily wiped, but never cleaned. A double-bladed axe sat beside it. Both tools matched the kinds of wounds seen on the victims' bodies. Tests later confirmed traces of human blood on the machete, though the degraded state of some samples prevented full identification. But the most damning piece of evidence was found inside Corona's desk drawer, a small, spiral-bound notebook, grimly referred to later as the death ledger. The ledger listed the names of dozens of men, along with dates, times, and farm locations. Most of the names matched known victims. Even more chilling, some names in the ledger hadn't been identified yet, but would later be matched to bodies still being exhumed from the orchards. In many entries, Corona had made cryptic notes next to the names, phrases like sent out, gone, or left early. To prosecutors, it was not just a logbook, it was a kill list. As detectives dug deeper into Corona's personal history, more troubling information emerged. Corona had a documented history of mental illness, including a diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia in the 1950s. He had been institutionalized and treated with electroshock therapy. While friends and neighbors described him as quiet and hard-working, many admitted he had become increasingly erratic in the months leading up to the murders. He often spoke of people trying to ruin him or stealing from his business. Some even noted he would grow angry when laborers challenged his authority or asked for higher wages. There were also whispers about Corona's possible motive. Some theorized he harbored a deep hatred for the men he hired, many of whom reminded him of his past struggles. Others speculated the killings were rooted in psychosis, with Corona acting out paranoid delusions that these men were threats. Another theory pointed to repressed sexual rage, though no sexual assaults were found among the victims. Investigators also interviewed Corona's half-brother, Natividad, who had operated a local bar and boarding house for migrant workers. Natividad had a troubling past himself, including an accusation of sexually assaulting a male patron just a year prior. Some questioned whether the two brothers may have shared secrets, or even victims, though Natividad had already returned to Mexico and was never charged in the case. His shadow loomed over the investigation. Still, all the physical evidence pointed back to Juan. Blood-stained weapons, handwritten records of the dead, and multiple witness accounts tying him to the missing men formed a narrative too clear to ignore. The sheer organization of the crimes indicated premeditation, not impulsive violence. He knew who these men were. He brought them to isolated job sites, and he buried them systematically. The police worked quickly to build their case. Corona was arrested that same day, May 26, 1971, charges of 25 counts of first-degree murder, one for each body found at that point. He was held without bail at the Sutter County Jail. As news of his arrest spread like wildfire, the nation watched in horror. This wasn't just another murder case, it was a serial slaughter carried out by a man in a position of trust. Juan Corona had hired these men to work the land. Instead, he lured them to their deaths. As reporters flooded Yuba City, they snapped photos of the orchards, now crime scenes, marked with yellow tape and makeshift tents. The trees bore no fruit that season. Instead, they offered up a harvest of horror. Each grave was a silent witness to Corona's madness. Each bone a piece of a narrative written in blood and buried beneath the soil. The clues that lay underfoot the machete, the ledger, the receipts had finally given voice to the voiceless. And the man who thought no one would notice the missing, the man who believed his victims were invisible, was about to face the reckoning he never imagined. By the summer of 1971, the name Juan Corona had become synonymous with evil. The quiet labor contractor from Yuba City now stood accused of orchestrating one of the most grotesque serial killings in American history. With 25 counts of first-degree murder hanging over his head, Corona's arrest sent shockwaves through the nation. But as investigators handed their evidence over to the prosecution, another battle began, one that would be fought not with shovels and search warrants, but in the court of law. From the outset, Juan Corona's trial promised to be unlike any other. The case had all the ingredients of a media sensation: a disturbed killer, a shocking body count, and victims plucked from the very edges of society. The courtroom was packed day after day, not just with attorneys and jurors, but with journalists, hungry for every grim detail. Outside the courthouse, protesters and the curious gathered, eager to witness history unfold. Corona's defense attorney, Richard Hawk, immediately launched a strategy that would define the tone of the trial. Hawk argued that his client was mentally unfit to stand trial, citing his well-documented history of paranoid schizophrenia. He reminded the court of Corona's institutionalization in 1956 and the repeated episodes of erratic paranoid behavior in the years that followed. If the defense could convince the jury that Juan had committed the murders while legally insane, he might avoid the death penalty or even a lifetime prison sentence. The prosecution, however, had other plans. Led by District Attorney Thomas P. McCormick, the state built a case that was methodical, damning, and unrelenting. They painted Corona not as a delusional madman acting out uncontrollable impulses, but as a calculating predator who used his position to identify, isolate, and eliminate vulnerable men. McCormick emphasized the systematic nature of the crimes, how each victim was recruited, dispatched, and buried with chilling precision. The evidence was overwhelming. The blood-stained machete, found inside Corona's home, was presented in court with stark photographs showing its worn handle and dark, rusted blade. Experts testified that the blade matched the type of wounds found on several victims. The death ledger, discovered in a desk drawer, was laid bare for the jury. Page by page, it listed names and dates, eerily consistent with the timeline of the murders. Many of the victims had matching entries next to their names, words like cut, sent, or done. Even more compelling were the receipts and work orders discovered at the burial site, some with Corona's signature, others with his business information. A forensic expert confirmed the handwriting matched Corona's. Ranchers testified that Corona had hired the victims for work just days before their disappearances. Several recalled Corona acting strangely, fidgeting, angry, or unusually quiet during the weeks when the killings escalated. But perhaps the most devastating blow came from the prosecution's psychological experts. While acknowledging Corona's past psychiatric issues, they argued that he was fully aware of his actions at the time of the murders. They claimed that the precise planning, the concealment of the graves, and the organized record-keeping in his ledger were all signs of cognitive control and intent, not of an uncontrolled psychotic episode. Still, the defense pushed back. They introduced medical records from DeWitt State Hospital, where Corona had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. They brought in witnesses who testified to his increasingly bizarre behavior in the months before the killings. Some said he spoke of voices and spies. Others described how he would fly into fits of rage over imagined slights. Hawk even floated the theory that Corona's half-brother Natividad may have been involved or responsible, pointing to his criminal past and history with migrant workers. But the court wasn't convinced. Juan Corona himself remained mostly silent throughout the trial. Dressed in a conservative suit and seated quietly beside his lawyers, he rarely reacted to the proceedings. At times, he appeared confused. At others, he stared blankly, his expression unreadable. He never testified in his own defense, and he never publicly confessed or explained his actions. After months of testimony, cross-examinations, and gruesome exhibits, the case was handed over to the jury. It took them just 45 hours to reach a verdict. On January 18, 1973, Juan Corona was found guilty on all 25 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as the verdict was read. Families of the victims, though few in number due to the victims' transient lifestyles, wept quietly. Reporters scrambled to file their stories. Juan Corona showed no visible emotion. The judge sentenced him to 25 life terms, to be served consecutively. He would never be eligible for parole. But the story didn't end there. In 1978, Corona's conviction was overturned on a technicality. His original defense team had been found inadequate, failing to properly present evidence of his mental illness. A new trial was ordered, and in 1982, the case returned to court. Once again, Juan Corona was convicted, and once again, he received 25 life sentences. This time, there would be no appeal. He was transferred to Corcoran State Prison in California, where he lived out the rest of his days in obscurity. He rarely spoke to anyone, reportedly spent most of his time in the prison library, and maintained his innocence until the end. On March 4, 2019, Juan Corona died of natural causes at the age of 85. For years, the fields of Yuba City bore the scar of his crimes. Though the orchards bloomed again, and new workers came and went, the earth never quite forgot what had been buried beneath it. The trial of Juan Corona wasn't just about one man, it was a reckoning. A confrontation with the fact that monsters can hide in plain sight, wearing the mask of respectability, while committing horrors just beneath the surface. Decades after Juan Corona was sentenced to life in prison, the shockwaves of his crimes continued to ripple through the fields of Yuba City and far beyond. Though time moved forward and the orchards returned to business as usual, the memory of the killings and the disturbing truths they revealed would never fully fade. The legacy of the man known as the Machete Killer is not just one of brutality, but also of society's failure to protect its most vulnerable, and the terrifying ease with which a predator can hide among us. By the time Juan Corona died in 2019, at age 85, he had served more than 4 decades behind bars. He remained largely silent about his crimes during those years, never offering a full confession, never showing remorse, and never explaining why he had turned orchards into gravesites. The silence only deepened the mystery. What drove a man, with a job, a home, and a family, to commit such horrifying acts? For some, the answer lies in untreated mental illness. Corona had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in the 1950s and briefly institutionalized. Though he was released and deemed stable, experts now argue he never received proper long-term care. As the pressures of his work and personal life mounted, his paranoia seemed to sharpen. Some psychiatrists believe that his killings were a product of deep-seated delusions, targeting men he saw as threats or enemies in a world only he understood. Others, however, reject the insanity narrative. To them, Juan Corona was not a victim of mental illness, but a cold, calculating predator. They point to his meticulous record-keeping, the ledger with the victims' names and dates as proof of premeditation. They argue that he exploited his role as a labor contractor to gain access to the men he killed, carefully choosing victims who were alone, undocumented, and easily forgotten. But perhaps the most enduring and disturbing aspect of the case is not the killer himself, but his victims. The men Corona murdered were largely invisible to the wider public. They were drifters, alcoholics, undocumented workers, and struggling laborers with no ties and no safety net. Many of them were never formally reported missing. Some were never identified. It's a haunting reality. If Juan Corona had not been caught, their disappearances might have gone unnoticed forever. Their lives and their deaths highlighted just how disposable certain people were in American society at the time, in the aftermath of the murders. Activists and journalists began asking hard questions. How could 25 men disappear from one small region without setting off alarms? Why was there no system in place to track or support these workers? And more chillingly, how many other Juan Coronas might be out there, hiding in plain sight? The case sparked a national debate about the rights and protections, or lack thereof, for migrant laborers. In California, there was a growing call for reform in the agricultural industry, pushing for better documentation, housing, oversight, and mental health evaluations for labor contractors. Although progress was slow, the conversation had begun, and it forced government officials to confront the human cost of agricultural profit. In Yuba City, the orchards where the bodies were discovered became grim landmarks. Locals whispered about the killings for years. Some claimed the land was cursed. Others remembered the helicopters and police cars that swarmed the area during the investigation. Even as new trees were planted and new workers arrived, the soil seemed to hold on to its secrets. Farmers avoided discussing the past, but they never truly forgot. True crime enthusiasts and documentarians have since revisited the Juan Corona case multiple times. Books, TV specials, and podcasts have all dissected the murders, the investigation, and the trial. Yet even with all the evidence, the case retains a shroud of ambiguity. Without a confession or motive from the killer himself, much of what we understand about Juan Corona is filtered through speculation and second-hand accounts. In 1987, a stone memorial was quietly erected at a rural cemetery near Yuba City to honor the victims. Many of the names on the plaque were listed as unknown. Flowers appear there from time to time, left by strangers, distant relatives, or those who simply feel the weight of the tragedy. It's a solemn reminder of the lives that were stolen and the justice that came too late. Corona's case also became a cautionary tale in criminal profiling and law enforcement. He didn't fit the typical mold of a serial killer. He wasn't a drifter or a loner. He had a wife, stepchildren, a business, and was known in the community. He went to church. He paid his taxes. His dual identity as both a respected figure and a remorseless killer challenged investigators and behavioral analysts to reconsider how serial killers can operate under the radar. The legacy of Juan Corona, the Machete Killer, is ultimately one of tragedy, not just because of the number of victims, but because of how long it took for someone to care that they were gone. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths, that evil can thrive in silence, that some lives are valued less than others, and that the greatest horrors can unfold right before our eyes, hidden only by our willingness not to see them. As time moves forward, and new generations forget the headlines of the past, the orchards of Yuba City still bloom in the spring. But, beneath the roots and fallen leaves, the earth remembers, and so must we.